Okay, everyone, I'll get started now. Welcome to the Sports Science Journal Club. This is the second one. For those who attended the last one, you sort of know what it's all about, what we're trying to do, and how we're going about it, really. First of all, I'd just like to, again, put a message out to the NHS and all the key workers that are working in the UK and around the world. They're the ones that are keeping the country going. Everyone needs to stay home, stay safe, and protect them. I'm just going to provide you a little bit of an overview of the events, see how it's going to go. I got that a little bit off the feedback last time, people wanting to know before the event started, sort of how it was going to go. So first of all, just first 5 minutes, going to be an introduction from me. We've then got Dr. Kelly Hammond on, who's going to be doing one of her papers. Then Dr. Shaun McLaren, who's got one of his papers on differential RPE. Then Professor Graeme Close with his paper on paper to podium. Then we have a roundtable discussion on high performance research in elite sport. Now that's going to go to around about 12:30, but it might just run over a few minutes, 5-10 minutes maximum, really. The event will close, and thank you to everyone involved. So again, I just wanted to reiterate the reasons why we're doing this, really, and I think it's really good, but what yes, of research, how it is used in practice, but you don't actually get the background which is underneath everything, and how journals are actually critiqued and disseminated in order to try to understand how they're set up, how they're even gone about, how the research even come about in the first place. And I wanted to provide most of students, academics, and applied practitioners with the different research which goes on in the different domains, really. So on that note, first up, we've got Dr. Kelly Hammond, who's doing some of her research on post-exercise carbohydrate and energy availability induce independent effects on skeletal muscle cell signaling and bone turnover, implications for training adaptation. Now, this is a really great study by Kelly and the team at Liverpool John Moores University. And I think this study really hits home to me the understanding that the applied practitioner can have towards a lab, and then also how a nutritionist can influence training adaptations as well. Now, Kelly, I'm just going to unmute you now. One second, Kelly.
Has that worked?
Yeah, you've unmuted now. So Kelly's currently the sports nutritionist at Southampton, and she's a lecturer at Salford University. Now, Kelly, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Okay, so first, just thanks to Liam for asking me to come on and discuss this paper today, which includes some of the data that I collected in my final PhD studies. So just as a bit of background, really, into the rationale behind the study. So we know that endurance athletes train in order to increase the oxidative adaptations within the muscle that then lead to increases in exercise capacity and performance. So as nutritionists, we're interested in how training and nutrition can interact to further upregulate this or maximize these exercise-induced adaptations further. So now, although we know that high levels of muscle glycogen or high carbohydrate availability is important from a performance point of view, in the context of training, it's now kind of well established that actually training with lower levels of carbohydrate availability increases the mitochondrial enzyme activity and some of the gene expression, which is actually associated with these endurance training induced adaptations that we're interested in. So we know that these adaptations to training occur through signaling pathways within the muscle, and we can measure components of these as a marker of adaptation to help us see how these dietary interventions might be beneficial. Now, over the kind of last decade or so, research has consistently demonstrated that training with low levels of carbohydrate, so both before, during and after exercise, increases some of the cell signaling within these pathways within the muscle, and this is happens both acutely and also chronically as well. So some of these studies that have demonstrated these beneficial adaptive responses to training low have actually utilised sort of feeding protocols which are low in carbohydrate but also simultaneously energy restricted as well. So because of this, it poses the question of whether the enhanced training responses that we observe when using periods of train low are actually due to the carbohydrate restriction per se, or actually is it the restriction of overall calories, or is it a combination of both of these? Now, some of our previous work has looked at components of these cell signaling diagrams in response to repeated exercise bouts, which are under conditions of both high and low carbohydrate availability. And we've found that you see increased cell signaling, which is comparable between conditions when energy is matched. So even though you see increases in PGC1 alpha and P53 in response to exercise, these are comparable between low carbohydrate and high carbohydrate feeding when the low trial is actually energy matched. So again, lending support to this idea that maybe it's a combination of both the carbohydrate and the energy restriction, which is upregulating the cell signaling that we see. Now, although these low levels of carbohydrate or these lower levels of energy may be beneficial from a muscle adaptive point of view, there are also some potential negative implications that might come with this. So research has shown that low levels of carbohydrate or energy restriction may negatively impact immune function. Also might cause increases in protein degradation and bone breakdown, which then, if performed chronically over long periods, could then lead to a potential detraining effect, which could then have a negative impact on performance. And impact on some of these sort of physiological issues which come into the Rett syndrome in sport, which is becoming sort of increasingly important in sport at the moment. So it's important to consider these if looking to utilise this type of training as part of a training programme. So with this in mind, the aims of this study were firstly to look at the effects of post-exercise carbohydrate and calorie restriction on the modulation of the cell signaling pathways that are associated with the regulation of things like mitochondrial biogenesis and lipid metabolism, which are some of the oxidative adaptations that endurance athletes are looking to enhance, but also to examine the effect of this on things like indicators of bone metabolism that may then be linked to increased injury risk in athletes if performed chronically. So in order to do this, we had 3 experimental trials. So the first one was a high carbohydrate trial. So according to the guidelines around fueling for endurance exercise, high carbohydrate before, during and after exercise. And this was also high in overall calories as well. The second experimental trial was low in carbohydrates, but still high in energy. So the calories were matched to the high carbohydrate trial. And then thirdly, a low carbohydrate trial, which was also low in overall calories. And with this, it allows us to compare between the energy and also between the carbohydrate as well. So there's a high carbohydrate trial and a low carbohydrate trial, which are both energy matched, and 2 low carbohydrate trials, which are matched in terms of their carbohydrate content, but one is a lot higher in energy than the other. So it allows us to compare between these responses and look at, is it actually the carbohydrates that are having this impact, or is it the overall restriction of energy? So to do this, experimental design, so in all 3 of these conditions, participants consumed a standardized breakfast. So this was a high carbohydrate breakfast, sort of along with the guidelines for fueling for endurance exercise. So in all of 3 of the experimental conditions, this was the same. Following this, they had a pre exercise biopsy to look at the baseline measures for cell signalling. And then they commenced morning exercise session. Now this was a high intensity interval training session, which included 8 lots of 5 minutes running at 85% of their maximum, with 1 minute recovery periods in between intervals. So immediately after this, they were given a recovery snack, which was either the high carbohydrate, low carbohydrate or high calorie, or the low carbohydrate and low calorie immediately after exercise. They then had a 3.5 hour period of recovery. During this time, they were provided a lunch, which again adhered to one of the 3 dietary conditions, before then commencing a second afternoon session, which again was another high intensity interval training session, identical to the morning session. During the high carbohydrate trial, during this afternoon session, they ingested 60 grams of carbohydrate within the hour to match with the guidelines, and in the other 2, the low trials, they just had water only. And immediately after this second session, they then had another muscle biopsy, and again were given a recovery snack corresponding to the 3 conditions. So after this second session, they then were given again another meal, which was sort of the dinner, which again was one of the 3 conditions each time. 3 hours later, they then had another muscle biopsy. After this, they were then given a snack to have in the evening, which again was to correspond with the 3 dietary conditions, before they then went to sleep. The participants then came back the following morning to have another muscle biopsy the next day, before they were then allowed to go off and just eat as normal. Blood samples were also taken at various time points throughout each of the trials, so before and after each of the exercise sessions, and also the following morning as well. So from the data that we collected, we were able to get an estimate of the energy availability in the 3 trials. So this is just to show that, as you can see, in the low calorie trial, so in the low carbohydrate and low energy trial, they were actually quite low in calories. So this is quite under the recommended 35 kilocalories per kilogram of fat-free mass that is advised for elite athletes. So that's just to show that it was energy deficit, when we can estimate that from the energy expended through exercise minus the energy that we gave. So some of the key results then. So firstly, if we look at plasma glucose, as we'd expect, this was significantly increased in the time points post-exercise following the high carbohydrate feed-in compared with our low carbohydrate and low calorie trials. Plasma-free fatty acid availability was significantly increased in the post-exercise in the second HIIT session following the low carbohydrate and low calorie feed-in in comparison to the high carbohydrate feed-in as expected. So now when we look at the levels of muscle glycogen, you can see that after that second HIIT session in the afternoon, muscle glycogen is reduced significantly in all 3 conditions, and this was comparable between all 3 trials. So although in the high carbohydrate trial they consumed carbohydrate sort of to the recommended guidelines both before and during that second session, the levels of muscle glycogen were still comparable to the low trials at this time point. Then at 3 hours post-exercise and the following morning, then the high carbohydrate feed-in has led to these being significantly higher in this condition compared to the 2 low trials. So when we then move on and look at some of the signaling, cell signaling in those adaptive pathways, P38 MAPK was significantly elevated immediately post-exercise, as you would expect, However, this was not significantly different between any of the conditions, so there was comparable increases in signalling with all feeding conditions. And then this went back down to baseline at 3 hours and the following day post-exercise. So when we look at some of the cell signalling further down in that pathway, again, you see the exercise-induced increase in both PGC1 alpha and P53 mRNA, as you would expect to see with exercise. However, there was no differences between the conditions, so whether carbohydrate was high or low, or whether energy was low, you still saw a comparable increase in the mRNA of both of these. Similarly for CPT1, again, there was no additive effect of low carbohydrate and high fat feeding or low calorie feeding on the increases that were observed here. CERT1, slightly different. There was a greater increase compared to high carbohydrate in the low calorie trial the following day from exercise. So that was the only one that showed a difference there. When you look at TFAN, transcription factor, there was no change at all, either with exercise or with feeding of this. PDK4, we saw comparable increases immediately post-exercise in all 3 trials, but actually when we looked at 3 hours post-exercise, you see that these increases are significantly higher in the low carbohydrate and low calorie trial when compared to the high carbohydrate trial. So you see that in the hours following exercise, there's actually an increase in PDK4 mRNA. But then again, the following day, this comes back down to being comparable between feeding conditions. So looking into some of the bone turnover markers, so P1NP is a bone formation marker. You can see that bone formation was significantly increased immediately post both exercise sessions and in the hours after exercise, but this was not different between conditions, so this was the same for all 3. In contrast, when we look at beta-CTX, which is a bone resorption marker, you actually see that there's a significant decrease in this post the morning session in all 3 conditions, but then moving into the second exercise session and in the hours after exercise, you see that concentrations of bone breakdown are significantly lower when carbohydrate is fed here rather than keeping the calories low or the carbohydrates low. So the feeding of carbohydrate had a significant effect following a second bout of exercise on the bone breakdown markers that you see. So based on kind of the key data there, the sort of main conclusions that we can get from this paper, firstly, in terms of the mitochondrial biogenesis related signaling, it would appear that when the muscle glycogen concentrations are maintained between 250 to 300 millimoles per kilo during that recovery period from that second exercise bout, the acute carbohydrate and energy restriction doesn't actually have any further impact on the cell signaling pathways that are associated with those endurance adaptations. And in the context of bone turnover, it would appear that consuming some carbohydrate before, during and after acute training session attenuates markers of bone resorption, and that this is independent of overall energy status. So it's more the carbohydrate that's having an effect on bone turnover rather than the energy availability. So those are kind of the 2 main conclusions practically from the paper. So thank you.
And I've got a question from Rob Norton to kickstart it off, Kelly. Thanks for your presentation. A couple of questions. Firstly, did the participants have any GI issues or general issues with the different diets? What further research would you like to do to build on your findings?
Yeah, so in terms of issues with the diets, it was a bit of a mix actually. So some of the participants preferred to have the low calorie diet around exercise actually, because they found that the food volume in the two sort of high energy diets was quite a lot to have that close to exercising. Whereas some participants really struggled in that second exercise session after having sort of the low calorie. Also, the volume of food in the high carbohydrate trial was quite a lot, and there was quite a lot of fluid in that as well. So some participants did struggle with that, particularly in that second exercise bout where they were consuming carbohydrate during exercise. There were a few GI issues, but nothing that meant that they couldn't complete or couldn't consume all of the food that they were given.
Yeah.
And then in terms of building on this study, I guess it'd be really interesting to look at this chronically over a period of time, particularly for the bone turnover markers, to see what the repeated bout effect of doing these multiple training sessions in a day over a period of time, or in the context of elite athletes, I guess, over periods of certain training blocks. Also, because of the findings that we got with the muscle glycogen, it'd be very useful to have another muscle biopsy taken prior to that second exercise session to see what the pre-exercise muscle glycogen values were going into that second bout of exercise.
Brilliant. I think obviously we had this discussion yesterday, Kelly, and for me, like how I would apply this study and I think about this study, if I was putting it into elite football really, is obviously in pre-season you get a lot of double training sessions and things like that. Now, if the lads are already not consuming enough energy in between training sessions, or even in the morning, or starting the morning session without adequate carbohydrates, then what is the bone turnover over a long period of time? Really over a 5-6 week period. It's not.
Yeah, definitely.
It's just one of them things that I think, you know, we all sort of take for granted, that we're trying to get actually better adaptations. But if the bone turnover increases, then what are the implications of that really?
Yeah, definitely, which is where, again, as I say, it'd be really interesting to look at this chronically over periods of time, particularly, looking at that. And also, like you say, within different sports, so looking at it in, football or team sport athletes, as well as just endurance based, to see how this changes and identify, I guess, like you say, higher risk periods of higher volume training, where you can perhaps maybe avoid things like your train low sessions around those time periods.
Yeah. I've got another question from an anonymous attendee, which is, with regards to the conclusions, are you aware of any study? Oh no, it's quite chronically. From Daniel Turner, great talk, Kelly. What do you think some of the underlying mechanisms are between carb intake and bone turnover?
That's a really good question. So I think it's still something that remains to be fully established. So some studies have found that there's links between insulin and leptin and IL-6 that are linked with the bone turnover responses, but we in this study haven't seen that. So I'm not sure whether that's just to do with the sampling times of the bloods that were taken, things like that. So again, that's something that can also be added to future studies, is to take sort of, particularly with the bone turnover, is to look at further measures that are linked to that, things like GLP-1, and also increase the frequency of blood sampling, because quite a few of the studies that look at bone turnover take more frequent blood samples, particularly in the time period post-exercise. So that might give a better idea of looking at various markers over a longer period of time, rather than just the 6 samples that we've taken here around the exercise.
Good. And there's a couple of questions just from two people, just really. Obviously this was done on only males, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Kelly? Now, the first thing I mentioned to you was 8 times 5 minutes, 85% was quite a lot, and it was a big load. And I wondered what the speed was for that. Now, was it males and females, or was it just? And would there be any difference in the bone turnover if it was females as well?
Yeah, so this was just in males. Yeah, the average running speed for both the hits was around 15 kilometers an hour, so it was quite quick. So it's a hard session. And it is interesting that you mentioned about the females. It'd be really good to do this in females as well, as you probably would see differences in the bone responses because of the links with other hormones again. So again, that's another potential mechanism in females that could link to the bone turnover, which would be good to include in future research.
Good. Do we have any questions from the panelists?
I've got a quick one, Liam, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure, Carl, go on.
Hi, Kelly. Another great presentation. Well done. And I know how tough it was to do this study when you were doing your PhD, so congratulations again.
Thank you.
One from me, because I know we spoke about this a lot when you were at John Moore's, and I know it was a bit of a surprise in regards to the differences between the low energy and the carbohydrate. And I know basically that the hypothesis is that it's all related, obviously, to the muscle glycogen content. But do you still think there is something in energy when it comes to, I suppose, upregulating the signals, maybe on a more chronic basis? Think back to, and I know John's on the line, some of John's stuff that he did back in 2013. Do you think there's anything in it, or do you ultimately think it is all related down to the muscle glycogen content?
Yeah, I think maybe, like you say, chronically, it may be worth looking into the energy again. But again, even with some of the stuff that John did, the muscle glycogen levels that he had even pre-exercise were quite significantly lower than even the levels that we had here in the post-exercise period. So again, that makes me think it probably is more towards the glycogen. Again, different studies have used different exercise, and I know in John's the participants were glycogen depleted, whereas here they weren't. So the differences in glycogen, I think at acute certainly it appears that it is the glycogen manipulation, I think, but like you say, chronically the energy may still play a role. So that's again something that's definitely worth looking into moving forward.
I think that sort of links into what Harry Routledge did a couple of weeks ago with his ultrasound, looking at ultrasound to measure muscle glycogen, so we could actually see the content of glycogen, and knowing if we could get them adaptations after training, if we could do that, easily and efficiently.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Anyone else? Any questions from the panel? No? Okay then, Kelly. Well, Kelly, if you could just answer, I think, can you see the Q&A?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, if you could just answer a few of the questions on there, which we've not been able to answer in the discussion, and that'd be great if it's okay. Yeah,
fine.
Brilliant. Okay. So next up, we've got Dr. Shaun McLaren, and Shaun's put forward a research paper that's not yet published. It's been accepted, but he's just waiting for it to be published. It's about the systematic reductions in differential ratings of perceived exertion across a 2-week repeated sprint training intervention that improves soccer players' high-speed running abilities. Now, Shaun is an S&C coach. He's a sports scientist. He's previously worked with England Rugby League, Great Britain Rugby League, Nottingham Rugby, Newcastle Falcons, and Hartlepool United. He's an all-round top guy, and I think the analysis which he's done in this study that people are going to actually find really interesting in how we actually went around getting his results.
Yeah, thanks, Liam, for the opportunity to contribute to the Journal Club today. I think it's a great idea and initiative. So I'm going to give a short overview of the paper we've recently had accepted with IGSPP, looking at changes in differential RP over a 2-week repeated sprint training intervention. I do have the PDF, but it's got a lot of annotations on at the moment. IGSPP notorious for giving you 2 days to do your corrections and then not putting it online for 9 months. So just have to bear with me for now. And I guess just while I'm on with thanks and acknowledgements, I just wanted to give a shout out to my co-authors for this, Dr. Johnny Taylor, Tom McPherson, Dr. Ian Spears, and Dr. Matt Weston. This work is obviously just as much theirs as it is mine. The paper actually came from a randomized control. And in this, he was looking at the effect of this 2-week repeated sprint training intervention on field-based measures of fitness in semi-professional soccer players. And we found some improvements between a straight line change of direction protocol. Not too much of a difference between the protocols, and I'll go into that a little bit more. But this study was basically an analysis of the training data from that main controlled trial. And the premise for I guess what we looked at here is based on training theory, in that there's a dose response relationship between external training load, internal training load, and then physical components of the training response and outcomes such as fitness and fatigue. So based on this, a reduction of internal load in response to a fixed or standardized external load could be indicative that an athlete is coping well with the stimulus or responding positively to the training program. And this has implications, I guess, for training monitoring and how we evaluate the response to training. So quantifying internal training load is a pretty important part of this equation, if you like, but it's not always straightforward in the applied environment. We're of the mindset that session RPE is a valuable and useful tool to quantify internal training load, but the precision of this, which is effectively a single score, has the potential to be improved by asking athletes to separate their global perception of effort into breathlessness or respiratory exertion and leg muscle exertion. And these are the two main signals, if you like, of perception in healthy individuals. The sort of theory behind this is it's thought that differential RPE might be useful surrogate indicators of physiological and biomechanical internal load, or probably more appropriately central and peripheral internal load. And for me, this has important implications for athlete monitoring and management, given the different adaptation and recovery pathways in those two, I guess, bodily systems. With differential RPE, we've previously demonstrated phase convergent and discriminant validity in team sport athletes who often recognise quite a substantial disparity between their perception of central and peripheral or muscular exertion in various training modalities and types. I guess what's yet unknown is this dose response sensitivity in relation to other components of the training process, such as external load and changes in fitness. So it seemed in the study of Johnny's, where we had this controlled repeated sprint training intervention where the external load was very fixed, and we measured the training response before and after. And again, this was a controlled study. There wasn't much going on except what we were doing with the soccer players. We thought that this might be the ideal vehicle to have an early exploratory sort of examination of the dose response sensitivity of differential RPE with respect to external load and changes in fitness. And I guess that was our objective here. So just to build a bit more on Johnny's main study, this was again a controlled before and after design. We had 15 soccer players, and these were from 2 separate teams, and they completed a 2-week repeat sprint training intervention. I'll go a little bit more into the intervention after this, but of course we measured them before and afterwards on a series of field-based fitness tests. And I guess the premise of this is the change in fitness, which is what we're anchoring the training data to. We did see some quite substantial changes in fitness. So the yo-yo intermittent recovery test, there was sort of a moderate to large improvement there. 5 and 10 meter speed improved, of course, given by a reduction in sprint time by quite a large magnitude. 20 meter speed or time, moderate to large. We didn't really have any clear or decisive changes in can't movement jump height or the Illinois agility test. So what we can probably say with a bit of confidence is that this program that we give the players to do, and they were doing nothing but this program for 2 weeks, 6 sessions every 2 to 3 days, we've seen clear improvements in intermittent high speed running ability as given by the yo-yo IRT level 1 and linear speed. And again, that was everything from 5 up until 20 meters. So in terms of the actual training program, well, there was 6 sessions, and this was effectively split into 2 blocks. The first block, which was session 1, 2, and 3, the players performed 3 sets of repeated sprints. In the second block, it was 4 sets, and that was the only thing that changed across the program. In terms of what they did, so the external intensity, this was exactly the same for every single session, again, with the exception that in session 4, 5, and 6, they did a 4th set. And again, this was either a 30-metre sprint or a 10-metre shuttle, which is there and back, with a 20-second rest. 7 of those were performed. There was a 3 to 4 minute rest period, and then it was repeated again for either 2 or 3 sets. The participants, like I said, the soccer players, these were semi-professional players from the UK, and 2 separate teams, and this was simply through the point of trying to get a better sample size. 15 is the number that we ended up with. We started with more, but due to adherence and missing either post-testing or too many sessions, we got down to a final sample of 15, and they were randomized within their teams. So we didn't have one team as straight line, one team as change of direction. Within teams, they were randomized to change direction or straight line. And again, the reason for that is because the main aim of the controlled trial was to compare between straight line and change of direction. What we did here was pool everything together, because we weren't really interested in looking at the differential effects of straight line or change of direction. Quite simply, we didn't have the sample size to start chopping that down anymore. So just to give you an idea, the reason in 1010 is to account for the time and the change in direction, and we determined this through pilot testing. So the idea is that it took just as long to complete a 1010 shuttle as it did a straight line 30-metre sprint. So volume, different protocols, but we tried to time match the volume of work that the players were doing. In terms of measuring differential RPE, again, we asked for separate scores for breathlessness, so depending mainly on respiratory rate, and leg muscle exertion, which was the strain or exertion in the leg muscles, how difficult it was to drive the legs throughout the sprints. We collected these at the end of every set, and we instructed the players specifically that when we asked them these questions, it was for the previous set that they've done, not the cumulative amount for the whole session, not for the very last sprint within a set, but specifically the last 7 that they've done. We collected differential RPE via the CR100 scale, which is a more residual fine-graded scale than the traditional CR10 scale, and has a little bit more sensitivity and precision in quantifying perceived exertion. We number blinded this scale to the players just to try and make sure that they base their effort purely on the verbal descriptors, as per the method of RPE. The words are for them, the numbers are for us. And to do this, we basically stuck the scale on an app, which allowed them to kind of free scale and treat perception as this continuous measure, not a categorical measure. And you know what I mean when players throw a 5, 6, or 7 at you. As well as this, throughout the training, the Warrior heart rate monitor, the Warrior GPS unit as well, just to collect, again, heart rate as a comparable measure of internal load. And with the GPS, again, a bit of a tough one, just given the type of design that we're doing. And again, our external load was prescribed. We were telling them to run at a maximal effort for the same distance. So this was just to maybe look at some summary metrics in terms of if there was any drop off in the 2 that we retained for analysis were peak speed of a set and the accumulated player load across a set. Okay, so in terms of what we found, the non-RPE data first, what you can see here is I've got the measures that are going to pop up on the y-axis, and the x-axis is basically just those training sessions. You've got individual session numbers, which are nested within sessions, which were then nested within the blocks. And you can probably see there that in terms of what we measured from an external load point of view, it didn't really look as though much was changing, which is good because we programmed it not to change, with the exception of doing an extra set. In terms of heart rate as well, some slight fluctuation within sessions, not much going on between sessions. Again, typically I'm exercising at around 80% of maximum, and that's obviously not as high as the true working intensity because we weren't trimming out between rest periods. Incredibly difficult with something like repeated sprint training, which for me is why applying RPE for an evaluation comes in as having its own benefit. This was the RPE data, and we've got breathlessness in the red and legs in the blue, and it should be immediately obvious that there's a lot more going on here than what was going on with the other data that was looked at. And this is what struck sort of me when I first started having a look at this data. I guess in terms of like, what's the bottom line? What was the overall average RPE for breathlessness? It was just shy of hard, so I think we were about 47 arbitrary units. and leg exertion was, leg muscle exertion was just above somewhat hard, so about 37 arbitrary units. So there was almost a 10 arbitrary unit difference between the two perceptions, that being breathlessness perceived harder than leg muscle exertion, which is maybe a contrast to what you would expect from something like repeated sprint training, which is described as quite peripherally demanding, and rightly so, but a substantial difference there. And I guess the premise of the analysis came through visualizing and just looking at these rates of change and then how they are then changing themselves. So if you just take a quick look there, and these are just the averages, and I've just put over the top here some slope values representing the change from set 1, 2, 3 or 1, 2, 3, 4. And you can sort of see here that you've got this within a session, you find each set harder than the last one, but that kind of starts to teeter off towards, if you compare, for example, session 1 and session 6, the steepness of the slope itself reduces. And again, in session 1, these were around about 15 arbitrary units. In the middle, it dropped from anything from 10 to 7 arbitrary units, and that's the increase in differential RPE per one set of sprints. And then by the end in session 6, we were down to sort of 6 to 7 arbitrary units, so half or less than half what we were seeing in session 1. So then we applied linear mixed models to try and have a look at this statistically and see if kind of the eye was telling the truth almost. And here's what we found. Now, it's a little bit of a busy graph. I took based decisions because I'm just going to describe them visually. These are the slope values that represent the change per one set of sprints. Those are the data points per session. That's the x-axis. And again, what you can see here, if you look at the differential RPEs, which are in red for breathlessness and blue for leg muscle exertion, you get this sloping down effect in that the more sessions you do, the less hard you perceive the next set, even though you always still perceive it harder. And again, just look at session 1, for example, where the increase per one set of sprints was large. And then compare that to session 6 at the end, where we're somewhere around moderate for leg muscle exertion, and the perception of breathlessness looks like it's still going down, and that's kind of anything from small to moderate now. So there's this reduction of the within session set to set change in internal load as given by differential RPE. And again, what was happening with heart rate and external load? Well, again, heart rate was right on that border of it's changing, it's not, we don't really know. And even if it wasn't a great magnitude. That's almost a flat purple line going across there. And it was quite clear that the external load again wasn't, or the external intensity wasn't substantially increasing between sets with across sessions as well. I guess just trying to look at that then another way now, because there was something else that I kind of noticed going back to this raw data. So instead of having a look at this, how it changes within a session, what about how does it change across sessions? And if you just kind of think about this from a design point of view, well, they always done session 1. They always done set number 1 and they did it 6 times. They always done set number 2 and they did it 6 times. So you've almost got like a classic reliability type study or a test retest. We tell them to do the same thing. And then now we're looking at how much did it change across these repeated measures. And again, something quite interesting, in my opinion, when you look at this, in that especially for breathlessness to start with, not really much going on within set 1 and 2. So quite flat slopes, if anything, leaning up quite a little bit. But then we get set 3 and 4 that seem to be sort of coming down quite aggressively. So the perception of, and again, set 3 in particular, because that's one where we had 6 repeated measures, coming down easier and easier and easier. And this is the values that I've got there. This is the change over the entire 6 sessions, the program. So the perception of set 3, for example, reduced by 13 arbitrary units. On the CR100 scale, that's fairly substantial. Some similar things going on with leg muscle exertion. Probably not as substantial, and then it's anyone's guess as what's happening to set 1, 2, and 3. So again, we ran a mixed model and tried to quantify this. Another busy chart, but this is just grouped by what they are on the left axis. And then we've got the change over 6 or 3 sessions. Again, 6 sessions for set 1, 2, and 3, and then 3 sessions for set 4. Anything to the left of the forest plot shows a substantial decrease in that outcome measure for that given set. Anything on the side is a substantial increase. Now, again, it's a sample size issue in the fact that we've got a lot of imprecision here, those confidence intervals for these are effect size units, just so that I can standardize everything, get it all on the same chart and have a look at everything together. Again, fairly broad, fairly imprecise. But if we're looking at those set 3 and 4 changes there, set 4, may as well forget about it because we only have 3 measures, but there seems to be quite a clear reduction there in that perception of set 3 breathlessness, which was evaluated at about 13 arbitrary units. It's similar trends with leg muscle exertion, not as substantial, and again, there's probably an equal chance that could have been trivial or non-substantial. Again, set 4, given the width of the confidence interval, it's almost not worth talking about. But anything from a heart rate or an external load point of view was either unclear, clearly trivial, with the exception of player load in that 4th set there that did reduce. So I guess the bottom line is this is what we found. We think that we found these systematic reductions in differential RPE, and that's systematic evidence by the mean change in the group of these slope values, these changes over time. And the important thing to keep in mind is that this was in response to the same exercise stimulus. We told them to do the exact same thing, except in block 2, we just added 1 more set on. And that was a controlled 2-week repeated sprint training intervention. Both teams completed the intervention in total replacement of training. It was at the end of the season. And we found evidence again that it substantially improved high intensity intermittent running ability and linear speed in these semi-professional soccer players. So then I guess just trying to explain why that might be the case. Well, the beneficial effects of repeated sprint training probably occur in the early part of a program, so as little as 6 sessions. And this might be a consequence of numerous physiological neuromuscular adaptations, such as increased muscle enzyme activity and buffering capacity, increased resting glycogen and phosphocreatine stores, changes in muscle fiber type and recruitment, or changes in motor neuron synchronization and firing frequency. So why would that change RPE? A good theory that perception is a result of the efference copy or the false copy of your central motor command that is sent to your respiratory and skeletal muscles. So in real layman's term, the brain says, body, you're going to have to do this, and it sends a fake message to the sensory regions of the brain to say, I've just told the body to do this. And then the sensory region goes, oh, that's going to be easy, or oh, that's going to be hard. So if those physiological changes happen at the level of the body, then it would directly influence the central motor command, which would directly influence perception of effort. The role of afferent feedback, so the body giving physiological feedback to the brain, it's up for debate. For me, I don't think it's direct, so it's not a direct perception of heart rate or what's going on at an intracellular level. It's probably indirect. So, for example, motor neuron inhibition would directly influence the magnitude of central motor command, which would then directly influence perception of effort. So that's just kind of the theory to try and explain what we've saw, and then to lean on the conclusions in that this could be preliminary evidence for dose response sensitivity of differential RPE. And if that is the case, then it could add strength to the bow that they're a useful tool, especially in the applied environment of soccer players, for monitoring the response to training or training interventions like repeated sprint training. I said preliminary, and I just really want to highlight that word because given the nature of the study, and we were prodding and probing, for me, this evidence is hypothesis generation. It's not definitive. So the hypothesis is that there's a dose response sensitivity of differential RPE, and that comes from this exploratory type investigation that then of course needs to be tested, and to what extent it applies on an individual level, which is really how you would use differential RPE in practice to inform training, monitoring and management. And again, I've discussed a lot of the physiological changes there because we had tests that were rooted in physiology and we evidenced clear changes in those tests. But this isn't to say that some of the changes in differential RPE could have been psychological. So for example, a change in the RPE template or increased task affect towards the end of the intervention, knowing that they were going to come to the end and they didn't have to do any more sessions. I can't and won't speculate on those things because we didn't measure them, but that would definitely be needed in the future to say that some of the changes that were observed were more physiological. So that's everything from me. Thanks very much. Hope I didn't go too much over 10 minutes, and looking forward to any questions.
I think Steve's got a question. Steve Barrett, do you want to kick-start us, Steve?
Hi, Shaun. Hope you're well, and thanks for that. Really appreciate the talk. Looks like a really interesting paper. What do you reckon was some of like so there was quite big like stand deviations on some of those graphs, especially towards the last set within the exercises. Was there any particular things that you thought that might be down to?
Yeah, I should have been clear on those graphs. Would have been a few. So the first few, the descriptive ones with the standard deviations, and they were fairly tight for differential RPE on the CR100 scale in team sport athletes. A between player SD of around about 15 to 20 units is typical. In terms of the graphs where I was talking about the changes, those were the confidence intervals, and like I say, for set 4, especially on that last graph, they were really wide, almost too wide that you wouldn't pay attention to what was going on, and that was simply because the effect that we were looking at there was the change across set 4, and set 4 was only performed 3 times in session 3, 4, 5. So I've effectively, the mixed model, we used it to create we give everyone their own individualized personal relationship of the change across set 1, 2, and 3. But that's 3, 4, and 5. But that's 3 data points. So it's just a lack of imprecision there, which is why I've kind of tried not to and suggest wouldn't overinterpret what happened in set 4 there. The stuff with set 3 a little bit more or a lot more precise, so can kind of be interpreted with a bit more accuracy.
All right. Cheers for that, Shaun. And like looking, I know you spoke about physiological stuff. Did you, I suppose the last couple with the max velocity and like the player load kind of stuff that you were looking at, was there any things from a mechanical perspective that you started to see within any preliminary analysis?
No, not really. And kind of this was a little while ago now, and I think sort of if we were to do it again, we would probably try and take more mechanical type outcome measures, because you know better than anyone, incredibly hard to get at during training. But then in a situation like this where it was a controlled trial and we could test sort of before and after, if I was to do this again now, I would probably take a pre to post measurement of something like leg stiffness, and have a look at that as a session kind of change. And that's again just to try and get a little bit more at the biomechanical internal load, or at least the response to that biomechanical internal load. Incredibly difficult to measure, and then in the applied environment day to day, almost impractical to even test every day. But in this type of design, then yeah, something like a measure of leg or whole body stiffness might have really helped tease those kind of session consequences out. And I think for me, that's kind of as yet unknown in terms of what those acute responses biomechanically are to a repeat sprint training session. So it would be good to look at.
Cheers for that, Shaun. I've got another question, but I'll let someone else have the floor for a bit now.
No problem, Steve. I think Patrick Holmes got a question. If Patrick, are you on your microphone?
Yeah, I'm here, mate. Hi, Shaun. Thanks for the presentation, mate.
Thanks, mate.
Just a quick one around the sort of practicality of it. Obviously, working in sort of team sport, we've always used RPE, and you've probably come across it yourself where you get players who sometimes after sessions just sort of give you a score just to get rid of you more than anything else. How did you sort of find that especially with like sort of semi-pro players? Like, were they sort of used to providing that sort of analysis, if you like, after the session, or was it something that you had to work with them for a bit before you started the data collection?
Yeah, no, it's a great point, mate. And so semi-pro, we were kind of on like the bare bones of semi-pro. These guys were getting paid, but we were sort of around 8th tier of the pyramid system. So they hadn't been fully exposed to this before. And I think that there's a benefit of that, because they don't have this kind of tedious association with monitoring in general. So they engaged pretty well, but obviously with that, there was challenges in that we had to make sure that before the study, they were absolutely clear on what we were doing and why. And again, that's mainly just to try and mitigate those factors of conscious bias, which is either a cognitive issue or a social issue. So the cognitive type issues with RPE and perception is that players don't understand what perception is. They might think it's fatigue or discomfort. They confuse those perceptions. They don't understand what information to try and refer to generate their response. They might be using the wrong scale, like a multicolored one with faces on, so then the response itself gets biased. And then the social stuff is your typical, you know, all the RPs get written on a sheet, and all of a sudden everyone's got a 5. Or kind of John's waiting for his RPE thinking, no, that was hard, and everyone else is given easy. So then there's no way John's going to give you hard anymore, is he? So yeah, we just kind of we did 2 things. We anchored. We use exercise anchoring in the fitness testing. Collected the RPs after the different fitness tests and the warm up, just to get them used to the range of sensations on the scale. We explained to them what effort and differential RP was and what it wasn't. That's trying to separate from fatigue, can discomfort, even pleasure, these other associated sort of sensations of exercise. And then again, we put the scale on the app, and that was just to try and avoid any integer bias from the numbers, to get them to engage with the verbal descriptors, and so that they could record their scores in private. And this was something that we'd implemented after training with in different teams up to now. And it just, as soon as a player picks up a tablet and the head goes down, they're almost in their own little world. They don't need to say anything. They briefly disassociate from everybody else. It's incredibly hard to then contaminate the scores. Whereas when you do it via a paper method, it's the other way, and I think it's incredibly hard to almost conceal them. So yeah, doing it on the app as well, is kind of given the instruction and the exercise anchoring was what we tried to do to make sure that, because this was the premise for this study at least. So you've kind of got to make sure that if you're working and dealing with RPE, that you really are dealing with RPE and not something else that is just a random number that the players have given you.
Yeah, I think that the app thing's a great idea. It's something that obviously we've considered as well. So I might drop you an email at some point about that as well.
Yeah, great stuff. Cheers.
Cheers. Thanks, Shaun.
Brilliant. I'm going to have to call it a day, Shaun, there. But if anyone's got any questions, Shaun's details are obviously on the screen now. So if you've got any questions for Shaun about this research or this type of research, then just drop him a tweet. I'm sure Shaun will be willing to share his email address with you yourself as well.
Cheers, Liam.
Yeah, so brilliant. Thanks for that, Shaun. That was really enjoyable.
Appreciate it, mate. Thank you.
Thank you. Just right. So next up, we have Professor Graeme Close. Now, Graeme is a professor in applied physiology and sports nutrition at Liverpool John Moores University. He's also a sports nutrition consultant to, most notably, England Rugby and Everton Football Club, plus many more, I think. Graeme, can you hear me? Are you there?
I can hear you, mate. Yes.
Brilliant. I'll tell you what, Graeme, I'll let you introduce your own study yourself, because I think it's something which is so essential for the world, really, to sort of see with this paper. And I think if anyone was like me and I read the papers for this journal club, probably from Kelly's and Shaun's to then Graeme's, because that was the order it was going in. I wish I'd done it the other way around, because I think people will know why once Graeme starts speaking. Okay, Graeme, so I'm going to stop my screen share now.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks for the invitation, and well done for setting this up. It's a great idea, and massive kudos to everyone who's jumped on board and trying to make the best of this bad situation. So this isn't exactly a research study that I'm going to talk about today. Rather, it was an opinion piece that myself, Andy Casper and James Morton decided to write based on numerous conversations we've been having over the last decade or so, I guess. And in many ways, the whole premise of what we're trying to do as applied practitioners is take this type of research If you're squeamish, you might need to look away in a second. And then translate that type of research, hopefully, to Podium. And there you'll see James, co-author on this paper, on a winning podium with the Tour de France Team Sky team. So, the paper was entitled Paper to Podium and Understanding the Translational Potential of Papers. And at Liverpool, Jon Moores, you've heard from, one of our excellent former PhD students who's now, doing great jobs in the industry. What we try and do is, where we can, study the elite athletes, whether that's in the field, and that's the 3 pictures on the top where we've got, elite marathon runners, pro rugby players giving biopsies, or even research within England rugby, you'll see on the top right. Or we get the elite athletes into our department. So we got top jockeys, Johanna Kontova, pro fighters. And we do our very best to try and study the elite participants. So it gives us the best opportunity of taking that from paper to podium. And based on some of these observations, we decided that it was important to try and put these thoughts on paper, because it's important to realise, and I'll work my way through this paper over the next 15, 20 minutes or so, is that not all research has translational potential, despite the fact that it could be very, very high quality research. And that is probably the first take-home message that I'd like people to leave today with, is that even though a paper may be in Nature and it may be the finest piece of research ever, it perhaps wasn't designed to have immediate translational potential and be ready to translate it into research. So what we did in this, we came up with a framework, and it was summarised even better in many ways by the Gatorade Sports Science Institute in the series of exchange articles. People like pretty pictures, and Andy, who's a co-author on this, is pretty good at making these pretty pictures. So what you'll see is on the right-hand side of the screen, the scoring system that we came up with. And this was a scoring system that was designed for people to think about when we're reading papers, to assess, does that paper have immediate translational potential, and can I now use it as an intervention in the sporting world? And the way we decided to score it, as you can see, is ranging from a negative to a positive score. And like I said a couple of times, the negative score doesn't mean it's a bad paper. It just means it's not ready for translation. So you'll see the first thing we talk about, context. And by that, we give some criteria. So a -2 score would be non-human cells with no exercise condition, where a +2 score would be human participants with performance measures and evaluation of the mechanisms. And then we worked our way through what we thought was key factors, which was context, participants, the research design, controls, the validity and reliability, the data analytics, the feasibility of the application, the risk and reward, and the timing of the intervention. And then based on that, we came up with the idea that if you ended up with a positive score, the chances are that that paper does have translational potential. A big positive score, so like a +14, probably means you should be running out straight away and trying that intervention in your hands. Whereas a negative score is providing the data you've looked at is good quality. A negative score is probably saying there may be something in this, but it's probably too early to translate it. So what I want to do now is work my way through these criteria and just bring one or two of them to life a little bit and give you some ideas of what we were talking about. So if we start off by thinking about the research context, I tell my students all the time that you always need to ask yourself whether that paper was mechanistic or was it meant to be translatable. So sometimes we'll do research and the whole purpose of it is to look at a mechanism. It's not necessarily to give solid takeaway advice that should have immediate translational potential. So one I use quite a bit as an example, and this is the perfect example because it's a wonderful paper in a wonderful journal. And this is one where I'd say it's an exceptional paper, but if we actually measured it on the paper to podium, the translational potential would probably be quite low. But how many of us have been quoted either ourselves or been taught or even may have said it ourselves that 20 grams is the maximum amount of protein anyone needs in any one hit? Then when we look at the context around this, what we should all start to immediately think is that the exercise in this situation was the one-legged extensor model. And does that hold true when we think about, elite specimens on the right-hand side of that picture, doing heavy resistance training in the context of real-world exercise? And I'm sure that a few of us would say, actually, well, one-legged exercise in reasonably trained people probably doesn't have the same application as whole body exercise in highly trained. You know, a few years ago, Kevin Tipton came along and, you know, looked at this exactly and used whole body exercise, and now suddenly 40 grams is better than 20. But I know for many years, I've certainly been told and certainly been taught that 20 grams is a maximum amount. So always when we're looking at the paper, the first thing is to look at the context, look at the, you know, the systems used and the methods used, and try and put that in a little bit of context. Ask yourself, is it a mechanistic study or is it one that's designed to be applied? The second thing I ask people to look at is the participants. And a big critique of mine is that these days in the elite sporting world, people think they can become educated from a tweet or a picture. You know, no one can tell a story in stickmen. What we can maybe do is generate some interest in that paper, but we have to get back to the actual paper and, you know, and spend a lot of time in the methods section. We can't read an abstract, a tweet or a stickman and think we understand that research. So even someone like myself who tries to work in the elite end as much as I can, of my 121 papers, I would say only 35 have used what I would class as trained or elite athletes. What we cannot do is use really subjective terminology to try and guide our understanding for, you know, terms such as well-trained. You know, so I pulled this from a paper that said 6 well-trained men, VO2 max of 55. Well, you know, if you've got a VO2 max of 55, you're probably going to get beat by that Smurf, you know. So we can't be using terms such as well-trained without really any qualitative data to support it. And I think Asker Ukendrup did this as good as anybody in the bioenergetics of world-class cycling, where he put this table together to try and define what is a trained cyclist, a well-trained, elite and world-class, and use things such as the training and race status, how often, how many times a year, what's the ranking, but also some physiological variables such as VO2 max. You know, and you can see here that 64 to 70, that previous paper I showed that said well-trained with a VO2 max much less than that, they wouldn't even be classed in this situation as trained. So if a paper hasn't given us any good descriptions of the subjects, but just says well-trained, we immediately need to interpret that with some degree of caution. And why is that important? Well, you know, this is you know, great work from Andy Jones around the nitrate story, and some of the original things with nitrate suggesting 10, 20% improvements in performance. You know, we're in reasonably untrained, and then in this paper, they showed that the enhancements with nitrate was far less in the trained people than in the earlier studies in the untrained, and these were only moderately trained. So then how effective would the beetroot be in, you know, genuinely world class? You know, yes, it still may be a benefit, but are we going to see 3-4% benefits at that end? Probably not. So we definitely need to take into account the subjects. And also, you know, something that I'm really glad we're seeing more and more of now is a demand to actually get a better gender balance in our research. You know, the vast majority of sports science studies are either men only or a mixture. There's very few female only research in sports science. And, you know, we know that in certain situations, not all, this is going to have a major influence on the outcome. So second thing to look at is the participants. The third thing is the actual research design. And, you know, research design, particularly in the applied world, you know, it is really difficult to do. And what we often do in the lab world is try and set up a study like this, where, you know, if you was imagining I wanted to look at puppies eating food, we'd set it up that way. Where in reality, in the real world, it's probably going to look much more like this. And this is one of the issues I, you know, have talked about a lot, of trying to take controlled laboratory studies and then apply it into the real world with all the noise of the real world and expect the same outcomes. An example I've used quite a bit is this one around caffeine. And, you know, I still think we need to do more research in this specific area. So if we look at the picture on the left, what we can see is that when it comes to caffeine, we know that there's a dose response of where you're going to get an enhancement in visual information processing. But if we go too far, you can actually get a decrease in visual information processing. So based on that and based on our observations, we're coming up these days with a value of around about 2 to 3 milligrams per kilogram body weight of caffeine. Oh, sorry, my phone's going. Okay, so 2 to 3 milligrams per kilogram of caffeine. However, if we think about where that research came from, you know, and I can see, I think Bobby's on the line actually at the moment, you know, it would be the type of study we see there on the right, where we're in a controlled lab environment, you know, we keep the volume down, we probably keep the music without being too pumping, and if we do, we try and control that. We certainly don't have the anxiety and the stress of elite performance. And I started thinking about this one day when I was sat at Twickenham with England Rugby. And actually, it was a day before a game, and I'm walking down the tunnel for the captain's run. It was an empty stadium. It was the day before our last World Cup qualifier game a few years ago. And my heart rate started going. And I was thinking, what are the lads' heart rates going to be like tomorrow with the fireworks going, 80,000 people in Twickenham, home World Cup, and the exact amount of caffeine we're prescribing to them is based on a study done in a calm laboratory environment. And actually, would that amount of caffeine in a real world now actually overstimulate, and could we actually be doing more harm than good? So I do think that we need to think about, you know, the actual research design and everything like that when we're thinking about our studies. And I do think as academics, we need to come up with more realistic research designs. You know, something really simple would be to do a caffeine study in a laboratory environment with huge external motivation put in, whether that is supporters, crowd noise, whether it's financial implications to do well, but actually try and create a more real world environment to see, does it still hold true? And actually, could it do any harm? The other thing caveat I would put here is actually doing the perfect study is hard. You know, and I'm not saying our studies are perfect in any way. This was our first rugby biopsy study. You can see here we had 4 biopsy takers. We took over the entire dressing rooms and we managed to get biopsies out before the game. They played a rugby game and we got them out at the end. We submitted this for publication and it originally got rejected because our wonderful reviewer 3 said we didn't control the distances that players covered in the game. So different players covered different distances. Of course we did. We played a competitive, scheduled rugby game. We weren't going to pull them all off at 10 kilometres so they all do the same. So our next study, we said, right, okay, we'll learn from that. And we did a simulated rugby game. So this is where we used the Craig Twist protocol. And we actually did a controlled game where everyone covers the exact same distance. The collisions are controlled by hitting a tackle bag, you know, and this is based on the demands of a rugby game. When we submitted it, it got rejected initially because it wasn't a real game. So you really can't win when it comes. So I guess my point at this point is that, you know, there will always be limitations of the studies, but we just need to interpret the paper within the limitations of the study. The fourth thing to look at, and particularly a hot topic for me as being a nutritionist, is the dietary controls. Now, if you've not read this paper, it's an absolute must by Louise Burke and Nicky Geacock. And what I would say is, you know, this outlines very well the methods that we should be using to standardize dietary intake before performance testing. So we need to look at papers and ask ourselves, are they doing things like this? If they're not, then again, we need to take that into some degree of consideration when interpreting the research. Now, some studies, and this gets back to what I said at point 1, are mechanistic in nature. So this is a study we did, you know, back in, when would it be, 2012, somewhere around there. And this study, I wanted to look at the mechanisms by which mitochondrial adaptations occur to exercise in the elderly. So because of that, I decided to get them in after an overnight fast to control everything. There's your first tip. If a study has fasted participants, the chances are it's a mechanistic study, and this must be taken into account when you translate the data, unless it's a study looking at the effects of fasted exercise. So if you're trying to take a study that has had people fasted and then translate it into a situation where people are fed, we need some certain degrees of caution. And we all need to look at some of the carbohydrate reference literature where the best effects seem to be in fasted athletes. Another example is, again, mechanistic study here by Glyn Howerton's group, where what they did to look at the cherry active was throughout the entire period put everybody on a low polyphenolic diet, avoiding fruit, vegetables, tea, coffee. So again, interesting to test for mechanism. And when people were on this low polyphenolic diet, there was effects of supplementing with the cherry juice. But we're just about to publish a paper that when people on a polyphenol-rich diet, we don't see any effects. So again, look at the dietary controls. It's really important. Validity and reliability is something that we've all been taught as sports scientists. But a little bandwagon of mine is that the validity and reliability, must be done by ourselves or the authors. We can't talk about this is a valid technique or this is a reliable technique. So for example, skin fold calipers, it might be a very reliable technique in your hands because you're careful, you measure, and you're well trained. You could just give it to any numpty. It's no longer a reliable technique. So reliability is in the hands of the tester, not always in the equipment. The paper on the left was one of James Morton's ones early on in his PhD. And I seem to remember that James did somewhere between 7 and 10 familiarization trials before he was happy with the data that they were collecting. If people aren't doing familiarization trials, often what we're going to see is learning effects. Another thing I wanted to show is, this was some basic CMJ data we collected, and you can see, shoes off, hands on hips. We tried to make it as good as we could. I got sent this by a friend of mine, some CMJ data that was sent to him. Look at the footwear. This is why validity and reliability is in the hands of a tester. Doing CMJs in a set of sliders isn't going to give good data. Another thing we do a lot in sports science is to remove any external feedback, which I understand because, for pacing. But if you do that to Olympic athletes, they would go nuts. If you think about a rowing boat, we all have a stroke box in it. So we all know exactly what we're rating. To try and get somebody to pace without any external feedback is very difficult. So again, look at that. And if it has no external feedback, we need to think about the translational potential there. The data analytics and presentation is a key one. We need to see how people are presenting data. So this you can see is the paper where they've looked at fat adaptation, and you can see endurance at 65% VO2 max is 4 minutes better on a 4-week ketotic diet. But let's look at that in more detail, and let's look at it with different presentation. Yes, you could present it that way for, a 4 minute better. That looks massive, and we could interpret that one way. But if we looked at the individual data now, first thing we see is N of 5, and we see that improvement in 4 was purely because of one person. So what we try and do in our group now where possible is present means and individual data. Moving on to the feasibility of the application, James put this nice little figure together for that paper to podium, where what we're trying to be is what we see green practitioners. So we want innovative research, but we also want it to be feasible and the application to be beautifully delivered. So sometimes there may be a real good intervention, but actually the feasibility of the application just doesn't work. So there's recent data from Chris McLaury about high dose fish oil preventing muscle atrophy, which is beautiful data. But that would cost me £24,000 a year to do that in my rugby team. So whilst wonderful, the feasibility of the application there just isn't there. And then there's probably no point me then saying, okay, well, I'll give a tiny dose because there's no evidence that at that dose it's effective. Where something like creatine is going to cost me £1,000 per year. So the feasibility of the application there is high, and it's one I can consider. Risk and reward, we always need to take into account. And not always an anti-doping risk. I use this example for the risk and reward. And this was a paper that looked at glycogen resynthesis when co-ingested with caffeine. And I heard on a podcast, I think it was an MMA podcast, someone saying that this is why you should always give caffeine with your carbohydrates because otherwise you won't get glycogen resynthesis. You're like, man, are you crazy? You will, for a start. And the dose of caffeine in that was 8 milligrams per kilogram. You know, it's not been shown at a lower dose, as far as I'm aware. And actually, if you think about a risk and reward, do we really want to be giving, particularly after, you know, exercise that's maybe late in the day, such a high dose of caffeine? And the final one, the timing of the intervention. You know, I've seen people talking about carnitine helping fat oxidation. And because of that, I've seen it pop up in pre-trainers. Pre-trainer, the only studies that have really shown this have been 24 weeks of supplementation given with high GI carbs for an insulin response. So actually, we need to think of the timing of the intervention too when we're assessing the feasibility of the application. So to summarize, well-controlled applied research isn't easy. You know, it takes a huge team all pulling in the same direction. You know, and this is some of the teams that we put together for our applied research. You can see the top left was our marathon study. The bottom one that Carl was leading on the weigh-ins around competition. Remember, two on the right, my rugby ones. So I would encourage you all to, the next time you're reading a paper, maybe have this scoring sheet at the side of you. And as you're going through the paper, ask yourself questions about the context, the participants, the research design, the control, the validity and reliability, the data analytics, the feasibility of the application, the risk and the reward, and the timing. Don't just look at a tweet. Don't just look at a stick man and then make an informed decision. Is this the right time to implement the strategy in your hands? On that note, big thanks to the group at JMU. You can see I didn't get the memo. It was Blue T-shirt day. And if there's any questions, I'm more than happy to try and answer some.
Yeah, Graeme, I think we'll have a few questions from the panelists, but I've got one just to kick off really. And it's something that when I was reading this, and it's in the title, obviously, with nutritional research. Now, I was thinking as I was reading it, you could probably apply this to all forms of research, really. Do you agree with that?
Without question. You know, I presented this a few weeks ago to the EIS, and they said the exact same point. You just need to change some of the examples in the paper, but actually that framework about, you know, where I was talking about assessing the context of the research, you know, the participants, etc. You know, think about S&C. The amount of times I see people talking about S&C interventions in 100 kilo back squat, 1 RM people, you know, yeah, you can touch your toes twice in that group and you're going to get some major improvement. So yeah, without doubt, I think most of sports science you could use this framework.
Brilliant. Is that something you plan on doing?
Probably not writing the paper that way, but I would certainly encourage people to, you know, somebody else to maybe do that. I'd be happy to write it with somebody if they wanted to bring some S&C examples in.
Good. And then just one from me really is, you mentioned a little bit at the end there. Is there anything you would sort of recommend to young researchers, perhaps someone who's just starting the PhD and are in that design process of study? Because I know quite a few of the attendees are in that process now, so I think you'd provide some really wise words to them, really, based on this paper.
Yeah, it's such a boring tip, to be honest with you. But the thing that we say all the time is you've got to read more, you know, and read the full papers and spend the time in the papers in that methods section. You know, we're so often keen on getting to the last paragraph, that take-home message that will summarize a paper. But you've got to remember that when authors write a paper, you know, these days particularly, we're also salespeople. If you don't try and sex up the paper, it's not going to get published. So, you know, the authors will have to sometimes overstate the claims. And it's up to us when we're trying to translate that paper to actually understand it better. In terms of the actual research design, again, I would start off by asking, what is the purpose of the study? Is the purpose of the study to look at a mechanism? And if so, then great, put all the controls on and do it brilliant. If your purpose of the study is to actually, you want to find an intervention, well, then do it in big enough numbers, do it in the appropriate age and training status of the group, and try and do it. But I guess what I'm saying is don't get caught in between two worlds and neither put the rigor on for a real well-controlled lab study, or the applied angle on for a real good translational study.
Brilliant. Have any of the other panelists got any questions? No. We do have one question from the Q&A. Two actually. The one's just come in then. Brian Saunders says that most people don't work with elite athletes, but maybe more well-trained or even just recreational competitive athletes. Yeah. Considering this, do you think we are sometimes too quick to discard studies with this type of non-elite athlete?
No, not at all. One of the things that we say in that paper, and I'm just trying to think my exact wording of how I said it, was participants, we talked about an appropriate training status with defined criteria. So, if what we're looking at is club level, well, then it's still really important that the people in the paper were club level or something similar. And likewise, you wouldn't want to then, there's danger translating something on elite. I guess what I'm getting at there is that one example I use when I've got a longer time to do this talk is that there's a lot of stuff on websites like T-Nation about the beneficial effects of ibuprofen on muscle strength. Well, that paper, was done on older people. And then actually in a different paper, it was done on younger people. Ibuprofen impaired the gains in muscle strength. So it's about making sure that when the paper that we're reading has an appropriate participant for what we want to translate. And, that's why gender's a good example as well, that, if something's purely on males and it's something where in physiology that could be affected by gender, then that's inappropriate. So it's not necessarily we must always work on elite. What I'm saying is that we should work on an appropriate population to answer the question we want to answer.
Bro. And then there's just one more from me, and we'll have to call it that there with the questions on this before we move on quickly to the roundtable, because we have gone a bit over time. Do you think the research studies should now comment their translational potential score into the conclusions of the paper with the rationale behind each score listed?
I don't necessarily know about the score, but I think we have an obligation of authors to make it quite clear whether we are claiming that this has translational potential. So I've stated in some of our papers now, in the conclusion, to add the sentence, these data therefore have immediate translational potential, if I believe that it does. And then when it's a real mechanistic one, it's probably important that we try and point that out, that, in our discussion, but why we've added them degrees of controls to actually maybe help the reader. Maybe one day, you never know, maybe all papers might give it a paper to podium scoring, but it's something that we encourage our team to do within JMU, to look at papers and assess them that way. And it's something we do as a class practical with our MSc team.
Brilliant. Okay, Graeme, are you okay just to stay on just for another 15, 20 minutes, just while we do the roundtable discussion?
Yeah, no problem.
First of all, everyone involved, probably you four really, you all have got a lot of experience performing that research in the implied environment. I just wanted to... Chris is on, Barnsley's on now. Are you there, Chris?
Yeah, I'm back. I've just been chasing internet. Sorry, folks.
I just wanted to sort of, probably a question for Steve and Jon, really, and probably Stewart. What do you think are the major challenges performing the high quality research that is got that kind of potential to the applied world within the elite environment? Jon, do you want?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off with that. Thanks, Liam. Thanks for organising this. It's useful to have a chat and also think and reflect about some of these things. I think first and foremost, one of the biggest issues is that if you're conducting the research in the actual applied setting, and I've tried to do it in numerous places here and also in Australia and stuff, you've got to make sure that the infrastructure is in place within the actual sporting organisation in order to carry it out, as well as the understanding from their perspective actually what it means and why you're doing it. You can have all the research ideas in the world, and you can have all the students and the staff from an academic sense, but if the actual understanding isn't there as to why and what, then you're probably already going to not get the results that you really want. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Steve, do you have anything to add to that? Obviously, before you left Hull, you set up that applied PhD sort of model there at the club. I think it was already running a little bit, but it was more formalised. Am I right in that?
Yeah, that's right. So probably over the 5.5 years at Hull, there's people that have like been involved with those kind of applied like studentships on the call as well, which would be great to get their opinion. But we basically we had a lot of performance-based questions that we wanted to try and answer that within a small group of staff that we had, we were unable to answer them. So just having that like kind of performance questions, John rightfully says, you have to be able to know where you're going, and also the infrastructure of the club has to be there as well. And you also have to have the buy-in. Again, like staffing structures might change throughout those kind of 3-year periods. So on reflection of it, the PhDs, while we've got some really good staff members in that, actually sometimes like those PhD models may or may not work within the fast-paced environment, because results are expected sometimes instantaneously unless they're managed correctly. So the balance between that, so we had 2 PhD students at the first team, a part-time master's student working within our performance analysis department, and a sports scientist and a performance analyst master's student down at the academy, all through like a collaboration created through University of Hull with Chris Towson and Grant Apt. And the students have all been brilliant, to be honest with you, and like we've got some useful aspects out of it. The masters, from a club perspective, we've been able to see things quicker, and that's because as you go through the PhD process, you like, I'm talking to the choir here, so to speak, but you have to do that detailed literature review in order to really delve into that area. So sometimes I think people might get frustrated with actually what are they doing, but understanding like why the processes are in place, and that's a skill that the practitioner who's leading it has to try and tell the rest of the club. I suppose it'd be interesting to hear from the other side of that with the other people on the panel as well.
Yeah. Graeme, have you found something similar to that when you set some up in Everton? I think actually before you were there, and then obviously you've gone in as a consultant as well.
Yeah, I think the key thing if we want to do applied research is you've got to ask yourself, what are the team going to get from it? It can't just be mechanistic research or research for research's sake. So for example, the stuff that we've recently done at Everton has had a massive influence on the way that Everton feed the academy. Though it's changed the structure of a training day. It's changed how, the timing of the food, the amount of food, and we've seen massive benefits. So for me, that is the key. If you want to do good applied research, the stakeholders got to be engaged. You've got to be asking a question that they can see a benefit, and the players have got to buy into that as well. Otherwise, you really are peeing in the wind. So that'd be my biggest tip, in that world, is to make sure that the research will help that organisation. And that's only for, elite athletes have got enough things asked at the time. They're pulled in so many directions. For those who are fortunate enough to spend, a little bit of time in their world these days with the media commitments and everything like that. And then even it's just a questionnaire, if they don't see any benefit to them or the team or the sport, then it's very hard to really get them to commit the time to do it.
Yeah, I think that echoes the point that Barry Just did an article a couple of years ago, actually, on all the touch points that footballers have throughout the day, the sports science touch points.
Yeah,
it's actually really interesting just to step in their shoes, to think what they must be thinking of the whole situation. And if we're going to come in as a researcher and start prodding them with sticks and bricks, then probably not going to be too happy.
I remember as a pro player years ago driving to a university at the end of a training day, and I won't say which one, but it was one of the Liverpool-based universities, and we did about an hour of isokinetic testing, and then we had to go outside and do a bleep test, and then we had to do something else. And, you know, our coach had asked us to drive through. And to this day, I don't know why I did it, what it was about, what the purpose of it was. And I remember thinking at that point, I'm not doing this again, you know, and what is the point of this? So, you know, if we are going to do research and take time away from the athletes, we really do need to engage them and let them, you know, at minimum feed back to them at the end of what we've found and why.
Yeah, definitely.
I think a clear thing here, Liam, is what's emanating from me, and also based on my experience, is that you got two forms of the research. You got stuff that's sort of observational, retrospective, which is driven by obviously a bigger question or bigger agenda, and then you've got the more invasive stuff, which Graeme's alluded to just previously with the biopsy stuff. I think when you're talking about touch points with athletes, etc., and you're talking about longer term methodology, integration of these methods into your daily practice does three things. It increases that ecological validity straight away. You see the impact on practice because it's feeding a daily report most probably, and therefore you've got greater translation straight away.
Yeah.
And that's before you see any results, any deep or detailed analysis in terms of the research question. So that organisation, those athletes are getting real-time support and feedback based on the research question. And then the paper analysis is just the final icing on the cake, so to speak.
Definitely. Now this is probably a question for Chris now, just moving on a little bit. Obviously, Chris, you've been sort of godfather of sports science. You've been in it since day one, especially in football. How have you seen the research evolve really over the years within regard to sports science, and how has that subsequently affected current practice, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously a really good question. I mean, we were really fortunate, if you like, in the early days of Middlesbrough. So I'm talking about 1997, 98. We set up, and it was by accident, but we set up a structure where, in putting together a department, we built into the staffing structure 2 PhDs. The idea being it was half-time research, half-time practice. What became very clear very early on was the biggest investment in the early days was to get acceptance of the people. It didn't matter what they were researching, but they had to gain the acceptance of the coaches and the players. So it was Warren Gregson and Rhys Thatcher were the two guys that we had on board. Certainly the first 6 or 9 months, they embedded themselves in working as applied practitioners. And then on the back of that they were much more readily accepted in terms of the, if you like, the interventions that had much more of a research focus. I think a lot of places have adopted similar models where the relationship between the university and the clubs has followed a similar path. The one thing that definitely worked for us was that the research was very closely aligned with the kind of questions, even in those days, that were being asked at the club level. I guess as things has progressed, the biggest change that I've seen, and I guess it's relatively recently in terms of applied research, is the kind of the exponential growth in the professional doctorate pathway, where practitioners are truly aligning their day-to-day work with the pursuit of an academic qualification. And I think the growth of these professional doctorates is something that's been a massive change, but a real bonus for both academia and applied practice.
Definitely, I'll second that as well. I think that sort of growth, it brings both communities together a little bit more, and sort of bridges that gap a little bit better than what it has been previously. I've got a question for Stewart now as well, really. If anyone else wants to get involved, obviously, Stewart, you've been you've done the head of research role at a Premier League club. Do you think there's more we can do to make them transformational improvements, as Graeme mentioned, within the applied field?
Yeah, I think, Liam, I think there's plenty more. I think, like all the gents have said really so far, I think that there are positive movements forward. I don't think we can take anything away from that, but I think John's comment right at the beginning of this round table was absolutely spot on. It's that infrastructure. Without having that clarity of infrastructure, you can't build anything. A lot of some of the things have been already said. This idea that elite sport, particularly in football, I would probably split the concept between an agile environment and a transitory environment. So, for me, an agile environment, which these two phrases that tend to get banded around, especially in football, is about the idea that agile can be progressive. So, for example, you've got McLaren making respiratory equipment for COVID-19 situations. Whereas sometimes if you look at the concept of transitory, then it's just quickly changing, not always to move forward and build and develop. And I think until we can get a structure in place, which I think, John nailed it absolutely spot on at the beginning, that, without, and exactly what Chris was saying there, if you set up a structure that isn't based on one person's idea, then you can lead to sort of, build and grow something. And actually have a better understanding that there's a real positive slant that hasn't been covered yet about the concept of implementing research into an organisation, is that there's a tax rebate. So undertaking research in an organisation can actually reduce your tax implications for the organisation. So, it's not just about, the obvious one would be very simply around the idea of, trying to gain knowledge and actually, improve performance and outcomes. But actually, to get that buy-in, from your organisation, there's always that concept of the financial gain. So I think there's plenty of things that can be done. I think, again, picking up on the point that Chris made there really, really well, is this idea of better partnerships between organisations, sporting organisations and universities. I think the lines in an ideal world, an ideal relationship, should become quite blurred. And yes, that might pose other issues, but I think they're good issues to have. But I think that partnership piece that I think, as Graeme and Chris, clearly mentioned there, can be done so much better. I think at the moment, I question sometimes whether, as academics, we're truly asking the right questions, and also whether we're involving that practitioners enough. And I think there might be a stage before that needs to happen. I think the practitioners are often, ironically, the experts in the situation, but I think there's a fundamental, maybe, stage before we actually put our research concepts together. And that's actually try and spend more time with the practitioners, actually understanding what the problems and issues and the hurdles and the challenges are. I think that often takes longer than people really understand sometimes and give credit for. And I think sometimes we put research programs together that maybe not fundamentally answering the question that we originally thought would actually answer the question that we need.
Yeah, I think you give a good enough detail there, though, Stuart. It's brilliant. John, is it any different in Australia? Is it more, do you think Australia is probably ahead? I know a few of the attendees today are from Australia, and that was part of the reason for the time of this being put on.
Yeah, it's a really good point, actually. And I've obviously had two experiences in Australia, two clubs. So to give those who don't know the context, so I originally went out employed by Victoria University, and I was embedded into the Western Bulldogs football department, and sort of started up a research group and sport, but as well as being an applied sports scientist. And then 3 years down the line, I then moved up the coast to the Gold Coast, where I was actually employed by the football club, and then went back into academia to try and then engage the university to build a research program within the actual team or within the organisation. So I've done it both ways, and I think fundamentally from those experiences, there's more engagement with the university trying to get into the sport than there is the sport trying to get engaged with the academic institutions. And that really goes back to my original comment about the infrastructure is that you've got to have somewhere that's ready for it. And if they're not ready, why aren't they ready? Is it because of your lack of ability to translate what it actually is and what it means, and why it's mutually beneficial? And I think, I can't remember who mentioned it before, but it might have been Steve, talking about the different students of masters and PhDs. I find the short-term students, now in Australia, they're honours students, over here they're masters. So that if you want the equivalent from a research project, is that you can get some really quick answers from short-term questions by just having like a student for a year. Now, the honours students, which I had heaps of them in my first role over there, I think we rolled out 5 or 6 papers within 2 years, because we had 5 or 6 questions which weren't programs of study. They weren't PhD programs, and so they could see the tangible benefits straight away. Whereas with the PhD students, you've got to wait a little bit for the information to come through. So it's really being able, as I think from our perspective, actually being able to understand the environment and translate what it means in order to get it set up appropriately.
Well, I'm gonna end it there from my questions, but I think a couple of the panelists have just got a few, but I am a little bit wary of time. So if any of the panelists do have a question, can you unmute your mic now? I think Harry Routledge has one.
Liam, you got me?
Yeah, I got you, mate.
Yeah, just a point for everyone really. And I think it's something that I've experienced being on the other side of it, is that it can be this misconception from the club or the organisation that by getting a PhD student, it's cheap labour, in the sense that they're getting a full-time member of staff and it's costing them a lot less from a financial aspect. And like Jon says, you've got to make sure that there's an understanding of your role. Yes, it being an integrated PhD in the sense of practice and research, but if that organisation isn't set up for the research or has an understanding of the research, it can be sometimes a lot of, well, we can get this individual in, they can be a full-time member of staff, but the reality is it's just cheap labour. I'm not sure if Jon or Graeme or Steve have got any sort of comments on that, or they've seen that in over the time.
Harry, you're spot on, and I keep going back to the Everton, and by the way, I've left Everton now, but on very good terms, obviously, with the team that's still continuing the research. But the key there was a guy in the academy called John McKeon, and the reason he's a key is that he knew that these were here to do research, which would benefit the club, but they were there to do research. So he gave them time for research, he gave them time to get into the university, and he made sure that everyone within the club knew that it was a researcher practitioner model, where you're exactly right. We put some, and I've learned over time as well, that there are some places where we put people in and they see the PhD then as a pain, and you're right, they just want the cheap labour. So I think it's really important that there's somebody within the organisation who values the benefit of a researcher practitioner model and allows them the time to do it and supports them through that process.
I'll probably second that as well, I reckon. Sorry, I just jumped in. I'm not sure I jumped in on, sorry. I'll probably second that, and I think that clarity is absolutely critical. I think I found myself at a lot of times, because of my role to sort of manage these both from an academic sense and a practical sense, is that I became a time manager as opposed to anything else in some sense, because I was having to manage their time both academically and practically in terms of what the service roles were, but what ensuring they were doing their research well as well.
Yeah, I think just to add on to that, I think it's, and again, most people on this panel have like some form of academic background. So I think these are probably the audience who are actually promoting this kind of work to be done in the practice or practitioner's world. And like, for me, like one of the things that we made sure as a club was that there was a minimum pay. So like the minimum pay. So when I first went into a club, they were paying an intern like £15,000 a year, for example. And there was no additional qualifications. It was just literally an intern was employed for a year or two until they found a new job. So in order to get the most for that individual person and also for the club, actually shifting that to an academic kind of position whereby it was a fully funded like PhD, for example, would make sense. Now, the master's students that we have, the reason why I say they're part-time is because they are part-time and we manage their time to ensure that they weren't being underpaid for what they were doing. They were paid accordingly. And I think that's something that really sticks with people now. And hopefully people like the Premier League, and Chris will know a little bit more about me about anything like that. But people in the organisations have to ensure that that's the process. If we as a discipline just accept to pay or I think the days of free internships have gone, maybe, I'm not sure, or work placements, I don't know. But that was one thing that actually as a club we said, especially at the first team, we weren't allowed to do. Now there was a work placement module at the university for undergraduate students. So we provided them with an hour or two within the academy to gain that experience. But that wasn't paid, that was an agreement between the university and part of their course. And I think that's the only time where I've experienced students not being paid, but that's because it's actually part of their module and it was very much for their benefit rather than the club's benefit.
I think if I can just jump in there, Steve, just a kind of a point to add to that. I mean, unfortunately, we're kind of overrepresented here from football, and I think every sport has its own culture. And some would argue that some sports are probably better positioned and better able to deal with this this situation and to actually accommodate and support students in their academic pursuits. I guess the key thing here is, and it's got to be a partnership really, and it's got to be seen to be a partnership that's supported. You do need, as you say, Graeme, you definitely need somebody on the operational level inside the organisation, but it has to be supported all the way up both organisations in the form of some kind of due diligence ahead of embarking on any of these projects, and that needs to be reflected in some written contract that becomes a point of reference should the goalposts begin to move. So I think at one level, for certain, we sometimes have some issues where perhaps people who are, the students at the end of the day on these particular programs may get pulled a little bit more in one direction than another at certain times. But that's where you do need this contract or this point of reference to which you can use to pull people back and actually ensure that all of the goals of the project are actually achieved.
Okay, guys, I think I'll try and call it a day there, if that's okay. I don't want to waste any more of your time or take up any more of your time. I know you're very busy people. So thank you very much. I really appreciate everyone coming on. Hopefully you've taken something from it. Everyone's taken something from it. But I'd also like to do a special thank you. Thank you to the presenters and the people on the panel, but also thank you to Performance Scientists and Dave Carolan, and also the Football Fitness Federation, because they've done a great amount in promoting this for me and getting the attendees on. And then also I think that your feedback is important. I think that tomorrow, everyone who attended the Journal Club will get an email, and it'll be to fill out this Google form. Also on there will be a video recording of the Journal Club. So if anyone's got any specific points that they want to watch back and maybe ask some questions, then I'm sure if you get in touch with the presenters or the panelists, then I'm sure they'd do the best to answer your questions, or myself even, if you have any questions for me. So I'd like to say thank you very much. Stay safe, stay positive, try and do something that you've not done before. And again, hopefully we can get back to normal quite soon and resume. Thank you very much. Bye now.
Cheers, Liam.